Good afternoon. I'm your co-host for the Practice Report, William Barth, and I'm here with my co-host.
I'm Jonathan Brown.
We have a great podcast today. We're going to be examining the question of the women's movement, and we're going to be doing it in a kind of an interesting way. We're going to sort of analyze sort of the broad questions of identity politics, broadly speaking, the women's movement in particular, and how this sort of all plays out in terms of creating a progressive anti-war politics, which is the current political question of our time. Again, we keep returning to this theme that in the United States today, we no longer have a progressive anti-war pro-peace movement. We're reliant primarily on, ironically, people like Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, because that's the only political force currently that's really promoting a anti-war, pro-peace agenda, trying to end wars, ongoing hot wars in Ukraine against the Russian Federation and in Israel against Palestine. We always try to return to that theme: is how do we establish a progressive anti-war, pro-peace politics? And we want to do that today in a special way to look at the role of the women's movement with regard to progressive politics, and also how we've sort of dealt with the women's movement in terms of our politics. So that's what John's going to talk about a little bit today: identity politics and the women's movement. So John, you want to give us a little overview of the importance of the women's movement generally and its role in progressive politics in particular?
Yeah, that's a great introduction. I would say for more than 150 years, the women's movement was understood as being inseparable from the socialist movement. And the idea was that with the breaking down of, the old world of the aristocracy and feudalism and monarchy, we had this new industrial capitalist society, this modern society was forming, and old patriarchal relations from the, chivalry in the past were starting to die out. And yet women were still not emancipated. We had sort of democratic rights in the United States, the right to vote and all these things that did not apply to women. They applied exclusively to property owning men. And so the women's movement was a response to that challenge, that modern challenge. And the way that socialism came into this picture was that the socialist movement had always argued that the basis of the women's oppression was rooted in the question of capitalism and, more broadly, private property throughout history. And what socialists looked at, they kind of went back to the dawn of humanity and studied archaeology and said the earliest human societies were actually hunter-gatherers, this very basic communal lifestyle where everyone lived in a small tribe and there was no real inequality. There was not a official state or government yet. People basically lived communally and shared everything. And in that time, there was no such thing as male dominance and women being subjugated and oppressed. There were perhaps differences between men and women in terms of which one gave birth and didn't, but there was no basis for oppression on that question of reproduction biologically. It was not until the agricultural revolution, when we stopped living as small tribes of hunter-gatherers and settled down and developed agriculture, growing crops, domesticating animals, that society advanced into these large civilizations where you had individuals who owned land and property. And these individuals that owned private property wanted to have stockpiles of wealth that they hoarded for themselves. And so in order to pass on the wealth to the next generation, they needed to control women and control reproduction. So women became confined to the household, to the domestic sphere, and to biologically reproducing for the passing on of wealth. In addition, women were also important for producing the next generation of laborers, so that the next generation of peasants and slaves and workers that created the wealth and worked the agriculture and on the land had to be reproduced. Their homes had to be tended to, they had to be given birth to and raised as children. So the basis of the question of women's rights for socialists has always been tied to this question of private property and economic exploitation and private ownership of wealth. So socialists have always argued that in order to liberate women, we have to go beyond the system of private property and live in a world where there is communally owned property, where people are no longer exploited on the basis of property. So the solution would have to be a solution that ties women's rights and women's oppression into the broader question of economic exploitation and economic inequality and private ownership of land and resources. And that is a long-winded history lesson of what the socialist position on women's rights has always been. And in the last couple of decades, we've seen a shift where there's been this deliberate push to kind of put the women's movement at odds with the movement for socialism and economic liberation.
Right. And so, this question that you raised, or this, by the way, wonderful lecture. Thank you for that. That was really, really, really brilliant, as always. But the question you raise is the question I think that we confront in our politics with regard to all of these movements, whether you're talking about the movement of African Americans for, equity in the United States and autonomy in the United States, or self-determination, the movement of indigenous peoples, of Native Americans, the movement of women, and other subjugated groups. And women are not a minority, of course. Women are a gender class. But it always, the same question keeps coming back time after time, irrespective of the movement that we're discussing. And that is, well, do we really need to change capitalism, the market economy, in order to have liberation for African Americans or for women or for other oppressed or subjugated classes and groups? Do we really need to change capitalism for that? Do we really need to end the capitalist system, or the market economy, the system of business that everyone in the country is a part of? In other words, African Americans can't obtain equality under the current system, or women can't achieve equity under the current system unless we change capitalism itself. Could you address that?
Yeah, so that's what the chief dilemma that we face today is this question. There's two different paths. The socialist path has always said that in order to emancipate women from conditions of subordination and oppression would have to require moving beyond capitalism by addressing economic inequality and exploitation and poverty, and emancipating women economically, materially, is part of a broader movement to achieve liberation for socialism. On the other hand, there arose a different movement that we call bourgeois feminism, which is a feminist movement that is what today we would call the identity politics version of feminism, that says that instead of trying to move beyond capitalism and move beyond the inequality of capitalism, instead this new movement says women just need to seek representation within the existing system, within the existing structures of power. So instead of saying women should overthrow capitalism and replace it with a new, more just and more equitable system, it says, no, we need women to be at the top. We need women in the boardrooms of the corporations, women sitting on the banks in Wall Street, women serving in the military industrial complex. So we need women who can be represented at the top halls of power in the capitalist society. And that is the question that is the reason why there is a sort of disagreement in some ways between the mainstream liberal bourgeois feminist movement and the socialist movement for women's equality through overthrowing capitalism.
Right. So the subjugation of women is based somehow on the not just attitudes, chauvinism, and men just thinking woman's place is in the home and this sort of nonsense. But you're saying that it's that the subjugation of women is found in the structure, the structure of society itself,
Yeah.
the structural mechanisms of how our businesses are set up and private property is set up, and it requires women to play a particular function or role, which is a subjugated role, almost as though women like, I don't know, almost analogize it to slavery.
Yeah.
They're a form of property or chattel because they have to fulfill a function that is critical for the economy to continue. And that function is a subjugated role of, being trapped in a home with no ability to participate in market or any other form of sort of civil life. Is
Right.
that yeah?
Yeah, so the idea of domestic sphere of labor, that household work is for Marxists, we would say that's like an unpaid form of labor. That you have, the productive labor, like you go out and work at a job at a factory,
Correct.
creating wealth, right? Then you also have, in order to for workers, they have to come home from work, they have to rest, they have to be fed, they have to be clothed. Someone has to be there to clean the house. They have to reproduce biologically, so that there's a new generation of children being born who will grow up and then they will
Right.
become workers themselves. So this
Right.
domestic reproductive labor is where women are confined and subjugated in class property based society. And
Right.
so socialists have always argued that in order to liberate women, we can't just say, let's put women at the top and have, a few women like Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris in the halls of power, but we actually need to change these economic relations that keep women in a subordinate position to men, keep them oppressed, keep them isolated in the household, keep them doing an unequal burden of work in the home. And that's the main disagreement, I think, that we see between the socialist question of women's liberation and the way that mainstream identity politics has sort of twisted it into a let's make women be just as capitalistic as men, and women can
Right.
serve in the military and bomb other countries just like the men do. And that's
Correct.
the sort of key distinction that has come up.
Right, but and again, we face that same question in the civil rights movement. Whereas should African Americans, fight to change the nature of the capitalist system? And Martin Luther King was always criticized for this, of supposedly having association with communists in the movement.
Yeah.
Or is it enough just to say, no, African Americans just want to participate like every other, worker in society and just have equity and, an opportunity to accumulate wealth, just like the Caucasian counterpart.
Right.
So this is the question we're always facing with regards to these movements.
Yeah, and I think we could, draw on that analogy with the civil rights movement because, Martin Luther King was talking about, integration, but he would also point out that, he had this slogan where he said, "You can't integrate into a burning building." Like using that metaphor, if American capitalism is a building that's burning down, how can we integrate Black people into a burning system, a broken system, right? So his idea was we need to talk about not just racism and integration, but also the economic basis of society and, of course, militarism and war.
That's right. That's right. So that was a fundamental part of King's movement was the anti-war, pro-peace aspect of it, which was with militarism and racism. He combined those two. I think it was three things: militarism, materialism, and
Uh,
you could call that capitalist rule. You can call that just accumulating wealth and power in the hands of a privileged few. You
yes,
can look a number of ways, and then racism, but militarism was a part of it, and probably the one of the greatest, most controversial aspects of King's movement was when he attacked the U.S. War on Vietnam. He got attacked kind of the way you and I are attacked when we attacked the war on the Russian Federation in Ukraine.
right.
Uh, a terrible reaction and response. So
Well, let's look at see if we can talk about a little clip from a few videos I pulled up that
yeah, let's look at
some of
this
the
and then
yeah, because some of the, the direction the mainstream liberal feminist movement has been sort of energized into this idea of supporting presidential candidates like Kamala Harris and before her Hillary Clinton, who they argued that it was if you don't support, Hillary Clinton, if you don't support Kamala Harris, you are a misogynist, a sexist, you
right,
hate women, you don't want women to
right.
be in power. So the question though is, well, what actual politics does Hillary Clinton stand for? What politics does Kamala Harris stand for? And in the case of just the issue of foreign policy, war, imperialism, US empire, the politics they stood for was a very pro war politics. So here's a clip of Hillary Clinton talking about the war that the United States and NATO waged against Libya,
Yeah.
where they overthrew the Libyan government in 2011 and killed Libya's president, Gaddafi. And this is
Yeah.
Clinton's
And let's
reaction,
keep in mind that's a what we call a war of aggression. In other words,
an illegal
the
war.
yeah, the only justification for war under the charter that the United States set up, the United Nations Charter with Great Britain and the Soviet Union, is that unless attacked and in self-defense, that's one basis to engage in a war activity, or if the activity is authorized by the United Nations General Assembly.
That's
That's
right.
another basis for taking military action. That's the only two bases for one independent sovereign state to attack another. And again, attacking a country in the form of a coup d'etat, overthrowing the country's government, that's an act of war. It's a war of aggression. It wasn't approved by the United Nations
No,
General Assembly, certainly not approved by the United States Congress in a formal act of war. None of our wars seem to have that.
no.
And that's just a constant domestic constitutional requirement. We haven't had that since Vietnam. But
No.
anyway,
Let's,
let's look at
yeah.
the leading women political leaders and their attitudes towards militarism.
This is a very short clip, but it kind of is indicative of Hillary Clinton's attitude towards war. And so again, she was sitting here, I guess this is CBS News, and someone just kind of informs her that, hey, we just killed Gaddafi in this illegal war. And this is her response.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed rumors. We came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? No, I'm sure it did.
All right. So
Yeah.
a very short clip. Let's play another one. This one from Kamala Harris, and more recent. I believe this was her speech at her presidential nomination at the
Right.
DNC, where she calls for the United States to build the most lethal military in the world.
And America, we must also be steadfast in advancing our security and values abroad. As Vice President, I have confronted threats to our security, negotiated with foreign leaders, strengthened our alliances, and engaged with our brave troops overseas. As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world. And I will fulfill our sacred obligation to care for our troops and their families. And I will always honor and never disparage their service and their sacrifice.
So,
Yeah.
what do you take away from this sort of pro-war rhetoric from these, so-called feminist leaders?
Yeah. Well, this obviously highlights the problem of identity politics, which is just because you sort of establish equality for subjugated classes based on identity alone, but without any politics behind that identity, just based on the identity. In other words, ethnic characteristic, the gender characteristic of the political leader, but not on the politics. You get this. You get this very extremist pro-war, anti-peace rhetoric from these female-gendered political leaders.
Yeah, and it even goes beyond simply being pro-war rhetoric. I think the United States military actually kind of actively uses feminism and, gay rights, LGBT equality,
Mhm.
diversity. They use that as an actual justification for war itself. They will, for example, point to a country like um, Iran, or a country in like Gaza,
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, and say, well, these countries, these are Muslim countries. They're traditionalist with conservative gender values, and so we need to liberate them because they are not liberal democracies with equal rights for women like we have. So, in other words, they sort of use the identity politics not just to elect women into positions of power, but they also use it to justify why it's okay for us to bomb and attack people in other countries who we claim don't have the same standards of
Right.
gender as we do.
Right. You'll often hear attacks on, what do they say? For example, the treatment of LGBT peoples in, say, conservative religious states, Islamic states, and so forth, as a basis to justify wars of aggression against these states. Yeah. So yeah, that's a excellent analysis.
One final video I want to show. I just found this today, and it's a advertisement for the Israeli Defense Forces, where Israel uses the fact that they have women serving in the Israeli army as a talking point. To justify Zionist occupation of the Palestinians.
Shoot like, run like a girl, fly like a girl, command like a girl. If someone wants to underestimate us for doing it like a girl, fine. We'll show them how we do it. Every fight, every shot, every run, every flight, and every command. Redefine what it means to do something like a girl. Because the idea, like a girl, means unstoppable.
Wow.
So
There's the liberation of the women gender class or identity.
yeah, so like a video like that is very, interesting as war propaganda because they're taking the slogan that is used against girls to say, you're weak because you're a girl, and they're turning it upside down and saying, no, girls are strong, girls are fighting in the army.
Right.
But what is missing from that conversation is, well, what is the Israeli Defense Forces actually doing? They are actively in this moment committing a genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. So they're basically arguing that it's a good thing for women to commit genocide just like the boys do.
Right.
Girls can be just as genocidal as the boys. Girls can bomb civilians just like the boys can.
Well, this is the obvious limits of identity politics that you're pointing out. So at the same time, women are subjugated, and that's the other aspect of this.
Yeah, and so the other aspect is like, well, look at this video and say, what about the Palestinian women?
That's
Where
right.
are the Palestinian women in this narrative?
That's right. That's
Where
right.
are the women of Libya? When Kamala Harris says, let's have the most lethal fighting force in the world, what about all the women in these countries that her military is going to be bombing and destroying and killing? So
Right.
do they not count as women? Do the women of Gaza not count as women? Only Jewish Israeli women count as real women?
Yeah.
So there's a sort of contradiction in applying, women's rights only in the sense of making women more warlike and more, serving of military industrial complex.
This shows you the limits again of a purely identity-based approach towards the liberation of subjugated peoples. and genders and so forth. There has to be this is your argument that it has to be related to the substructure of society.
Yes.
Otherwise, you get this sort of weird pathological result where you have, women or, other subjugated groups committing the same heinous crimes around the world and promoting the same militarism around the world that men do. And yeah, you always say, do you have to change all of society just to have liberation? And I guess your response might be yes. Is that right?
It's hard to say that we can, integrate into a unequal,
burning building.
A burning building. How are you supposed to integrate into a system that is inherently oppressive? So certain groups of women, Western women in the United States or in Israel or in Western countries, maybe they can rise to the top and serve in the military or serve as a CEO of a corporation, but there's still going to be poor women who are doing the hard work, or the women who are getting bombed and killed by these Israeli Defense Force women. So unfortunately, it's a bit of a contradiction. And I think maybe we can close out by just talking about what does this mean for the broader question of the anti-war movement? And I'd be really curious of your how would you think about what can we do to sort of, because our position is that we are we are pro women, we are pro liberation, we are against the subjugation of women, but we don't think that the solution to that question is for just for women to become just as much of warmongers and capitalist pigs as the men are, but that maybe the solution is that we somehow have a more radical transformation. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I have to admit, I think you sort of highlighted the point, which is, again, we started with the question that affects all liberation movements, which is, do you have to change the structure of society itself just to liberate, again, African Americans, women, LGBT peoples, abled and disabled, the ableist community or the disabled community, and on and on. Do you have to change the structure of society to have liberation, or is it enough to just simply, have identity politics, to just say, well, we'll allow an LGBTQ person or a woman to rise to the boardroom, director of the board of directors. And you're showing with clips like this and this evidence that no, you have to change society. You have to do what Martin Luther King said. You have to combine the civil rights movement with the movement against war, against militarism and materialism, which goes to the structure of the substructure of society itself. You have to combine these things, or you're going to get the result that you're highlighting right now.
That's a great summation. Excellent.
So I don't know. I mean, I would think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've seen this play out with, it's often said that the victory of the civil rights movement, a lot of what liberals would say is that the election of Obama was the culmination of that. And we saw, people were thinking Obama, the first Black president, is going to achieve some sort of collective liberation for Black people as a whole.
But look at the condition of the African American masses in America today. How far is we're like almost a half a century after the 60s civil rights movement now, well over a half century, and we still have the problems of mass incarceration, extrajudicial executions by police of African Americans and African American men and women. And on, the wealth, income inequality between African Americans and other American groups. So we're the so-called civil rights movement, separated from militarism and materialism, has not produced the result that we had hoped it would.
Yeah, and I think that's the main takeaway from this episode for our listeners is that in order to really achieve liberation for any group that is oppressed in our society, it has to come by challenging militarism, war, and capitalism. You can't just expect to keep the same system of oppression, the same system of exploitation, the same system of endless war, and expect any group to be equal and have a fair shot. The only way to do it is to have actually a more radical transformation. And that's why we see this problem we keep running into, that the system wants to just take one or two individuals, a Barack Obama or a Hillary Clinton or a Kamala Harris, and put them in the power and make them the face and say, look, our system is better. We've got this, people who are women or gay people or people of color, they're in power now too. But the system is still generating the same inequalities, the same oppression, the same war. So we need to find ways to go beyond that and to go to a more deeper and more radical transformation. And that's something hopefully you and I can continue to.
Right. And that was a great information, John. Thanks for helping us to get there and educating us in this regard, because you really sort of highlighted the principle that we need to try to reach in order to succeed at this. So thank you for that. It was really brilliant.
Well, brilliant episode, Will. Great
Yeah.
discussion. So thanks, guys, for tuning in. We are the Praxis Report, and you can follow us on YouTube. We have an Instagram page. Be sure to like our episode if you enjoyed our discussion, and subscribe to our channel so you can see all our new content every week. And please leave us a comment. If you love us, you hate us, send us a message. Let us know. But
peace, love, and understanding.
I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brown.
And I'm your co-host, William Barth.
Thanks. Peace, y'all.
Peace.